When we think of Rudyard Kipling, we often picture the grand, sweeping landscapes of the British Raj or the tales of imperial adventure. But in his collection, The Phantom, Rickshaw, and Other Ghost Stories, we find something much more unsettling. This isn't just a book of spooky tales meant to give you a shiver, it is a deep dive into the things that refuse to stay buried. Kipling explores the idea that whether it is a literal ghost, a forgotten crime, or a memory from 1,000 years ago, the past is an inescapable force that eventually breaks into the present. The collection opens with a story that feels more like a psychological thriller than a traditional ghost story. It's called The Phantom Rickshaw, and it takes us into the high society circles of Simla. We meet a man named Jack Pansay. On the surface, he's a man trying to move on with his life, celebrating a new engagement to a woman named Kitty Mannering. But Pansay is carrying a weight that no amount of social climbing can lift. He had a past affair with a woman named Agnes Keith-Wessington, and her death has left a hole in his soul that he tries to fill with the distractions of colonial life. The supernatural enters not as a shadow in a dark alley, but as a sudden, impossible disruption of reality. While Pansay is out with Kitty, he sees it, a rickshaw moving through the streets, driven by the ghost of Agnes. It isn't just a vision, it's a physical presence that defies the laws of nature. In one terrifying moment, the phantom rickshaw passes directly through Kitty's horse without causing any injury or even a stumble. The horse is fine, but Pansay is shattered. This is where the story shifts from the supernatural to the social. Pansay tries to play it off. He uses medical excuses to explain his outbursts and his growing terror, hoping that if he treats his fear as a mere nervous breakdown, the world will let him stay part of the club. But you can't hide a haunting from your peers forever. His erratic behaviour becomes a scandal, and the social machinery of the British Raj is unforgiving. Kitty breaks off the engagement, and Pansay is cast out, becoming a social pariah. He ends up living in a state of total isolation, haunted not just by the ghost of the woman he wronged, but by the realization that he can never truly escape what he has done. Kipling balances these heavy psychological hauntings with shorter, more visceral experiences, like in My Own True Ghost Story. In this tale, the narrator stays at a remote dark bungalow in Katmul, where he is woken up by the distinct rhythmic sounds of a game of billiards being played in the next room. It's a mundane sound, but in the silence of the Indian night, it's jarring. The next morning, he discovers there was no one else in the bungalow. The owner reveals that the room had been a billiard hall 10 years prior, and the ghost of an engineer who loved the game occasionally returns to play. It's a simpler ghost story, but it reinforces the collection's theme. The environment itself remembers the people who once inhabited it. From these hauntings, Kipling moves us to the vast, punishing emptiness of the desert in a story called Morrowby Jukes. This is a tale about survival and what happens to the human soul when it is pushed to the absolute edge of existence. Morrowby Jukes is a civil engineer, a man of science and order, who finds himself suffering from a fever in the desert. When he recovers, he finds himself in a bizarre, terrifying situation. He is at the bottom of a massive sand crater. This crater is a world unto itself, inhabited by a group of people who have survived a cholera outbreak by living in a sort of permanent, desperate state of survival. They are, in a sense, the living dead people who were presumed dead and left for cremation, only to wake up and find themselves trapped in a pit. In this pit, Jukes encounters a man named Gunga Das. Gunga Das was once a Brahmin, a man of high spiritual standing, but the brutality of the crater has stripped away every vestige of his former dignity. He has become a skeletal scavenger, a man who has traded his soul for the chance to stay alive in a lawless republic of sand. Jukes eventually discovers the dark secret of this place. He finds a mummified corpse and realizes that Gunga Das had murdered a previous European traveller specifically to keep the secret of a safe path out of the crater to himself. The inhabitants aren't just survivors, they are trapped by their own geography and the constant threat of quicksand, creating a cycle of greed and violence. Jukes eventually manages to escape, aided by his loyal dog, Boy Dunnu, but he leaves the crater forever changed by the realization of how quickly a human being can descend into something primal when faced with death. From the desert, the narrative shifts again, moving into the epic, legendary scale of the stories involving Daniel Dravot and Peachy Carnahan. This is perhaps the most famous thread in the collection, though it is often discussed on its own. It is a story of massive, almost mythic ambition. Dravot and Carnahan are men who are bored with the constraints of the civilized world. They want to be more than just British subjects, they want to be kings. They travel into the rugged, mountainous region of Kafiristan, armed with modern rifles and a sense of divine purpose. They don't just fight their way to the top, they use the tools of civilization to manufacture a religion. They use Masonic rituals and the sheer, terrifying power of gunpowder to convince the local tribes that they are something more than men. They build a kingdom, a structured society where they are treated as quasi-divine rulers. But the story is a study in hubris. Dravot begins to believe his own myth. He becomes intoxicated by his own power and decides that he must have a political marriage to a local woman to solidify his rule. This is his fatal mistake. During the wedding ceremony, the bride bites him, a small, human act that has devastating consequences. The bite draws blood, and in that moment, the tribespeople see him not as a god, but as a man who can bleed. The illusion of his divinity evaporates instantly. The revolt is swift and violent. The group is hunted through the mountains, fleeing the very people they once commanded. As they are cornered, Dravot chooses a defiant, tragic end. He leaps from a high rope bridge to avoid being captured and humiliated. He dies a king in his own mind, but a man who failed to understand the limits of his own mortality. Carnahan is the one who survives, but he is a broken man, a survivor of a fallen empire who carries the weight of their failed glory back to the narrator, a ghost of the man he used to be. This leads us to the final, most philosophical story in the collection, the finest story in the world. It moves away from the grand adventures and the desert pits and settles into the quiet, domestic life of a bank clerk named Charlie Mears. Charlie is a man who possesses something extraordinary. He has vivid, visceral memories of past lives. He doesn't just have dreams, he has notions that are so intense they feel like actual historical experiences. He remembers being a Greek galley slave, feeling the weight of the oars and the heat of the sun, and he remembers being a hero in the Viking era. These aren't just fantasies, they are real, historical truths bleeding through the veil of time into his modern, quiet life. The narrator realizes that Charlie is a vessel for the past, a bridge between who we were and who we are. But the story carries a profound, almost haunting warning. It suggests that there is a reason we don't remember everything. The lords of life and death allow these memories to surface only as long as the person remains unanchored to the present. As Charlie begins to fall in love with a local woman, he finds himself becoming rooted in the here and now. He develops a stake in his current life, a reason to stay in the present. And as he anchors himself to the woman and the life he is building, the ancient, profound memories begin to fade. The Greek galley slave and the Viking hero vanish, replaced by the mundane concerns of a clerk in love. The story ends with a sense of loss. The narrator is left with an unfinished epic, a lost truth that was right there for the taking, but was surrendered for the sake of being human. When we look at these 5 stories together, a pattern emerges. Kipling is obsessed with the idea of the liminal space, the threshold between one state and another. We see it in the phantom rickshaw that exists between the physical and the spiritual. We see it in the people in the desert crater who are caught between being living humans and the dead. We see it in Dravot, who stands on the threshold between being a man and being a god. And we see it in Charlie Mears, who exists between the many lives he has lived and the one life he is currently leading. There is a recurring tension throughout the book between the rational, scientific worldview of the British Empire and the inexplicable, often brutal realities of the landscapes they try to govern. The characters often try to use logic, medicine, or technology to control their surroundings. Pansay tries to use medical excuses to explain away a ghost. The British try to use rifles and rituals to rule Kafiristan. The civil engineer tries to map the desert. But the world in Kipling's stories refuses to be mapped or managed. The past, the supernatural, and the sheer brutality of survival always find a way to break through the veneer of civilization. The collection suggests that human identity is much more fragile than we like to admit. We build our lives on the foundations of the present, our jobs, our social standing, our relationships, but those foundations are constantly being pressured by things we cannot control. We are haunted by our mistakes, threatened by the environments we inhabit, and shaped by histories we don't even remember. In the end, Kipling seems to suggest that the cost of living a stable, meaningful life in the present is a certain kind of forgetting. To be a person in the world, we have to let go of the echoes of the past, whether those echoes are the ghosts of our own transgressions or the memories of lives we lived 1,000 years ago. We walk through the present, trying to make sense of our lives, while carrying the weight of everything that came before us, even if we can no longer hear it.